Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. All over the country this week, regular people are mobilizing against Donald Trump and his administration's overreach, both against his reckless, destructive efforts to detain law-abiding, peaceful neighbors in communities across the country, and also his decision, under dubious legal authority, to mobilize the National Guard and the Marines against peaceful demonstrators. Today, we are seeing folks taking the streets demonstrating against what is happening in this country, from Los Angeles to New York, El Paso to Raleigh. And this weekend, there will be many, many more protests, coast to coast, in cities big and small towns, to counter-program Trump's North Korean-style military parade he's throwing himself on his 79th birthday. Those protesters have a simple message: we have no king in America. The constitutional right to protest, enshrined in the First Amendment, exists for a reason. And I got to say, watching all this develop over the last few days, it feels odd to have to say this, but protests are good, actually. Protests against cruelty and tyranny and for our shared values are a good thing, and never more so than in the face of an authoritarian threat to our most cherished liberties. And to be clear, any debate about the optics of peaceful protest or whether or not demonstrators are just playing into Donald Trump's hands obfuscates the fact that people should be peacefully protesting against the ongoing attempt to end American democracy we've been witnessing. An attempt that began on Trump's first day in office of this term, when, as one of his very first official acts as president, he pardoned every single participant in the violent insurrection he incited at the Capitol on January 6th. Even the people who bashed the heads of cops in. The people convicted of seditious conspiracy against our country in jury trials. Of course, the Attorney General and Trump's spokesperson, as she is, says this is all different somehow.
You've been criticized for having a double standard with the president pardoning all these people who attacked police officers on January 6th in his first day in office. How do you answer that criticism?
Well, this is very different. These are people out there hurting people in California right now. This is ongoing, no longer. We're going to protect them. We're going to do everything we can to prosecute violent criminals in California. California is burning. These people are waving Mexican flags, yet they don't want anyone to go back to Mexico. They're burning American flags. This is the United States of America, and we're going to protect Americans. We're going to protect all citizens out there.
First of all, I'm just duty-bound to say, when January 6th was ongoing, when people were getting hurt and Donald Trump had a chance to stop it, he didn't, remember? Crucially, right? So when it was happening, when he was watching the coverage of the cops getting their heads bashed in, he didn't stop it. Also, she's, I think, misrepresenting the protests in California. The Constitution protects waving a Mexican flag at a protest. If foreign flags require the National Guard, I got bad news for some members of Congress. Perhaps most importantly, the January 6th rioters hurt people. They assaulted cops with bear spray and tasers and flagpoles. Those pardons on that first day made it crystal clear, if it wasn't already, it was to me, but for anyone else who was following. Donald Trump does not care a whit about law and order, about the law, about any order other than one with him on top. No, he's federalizing the National Guard. He's sending Marines in the streets of Los Angeles because he wants to silence any dissent by force. He's been fantasizing about this moment for years. And he's also scared of mass public opposition to him. That's why his own White House is outright lying about the protesters.
The president, as I just answered, supports the right of Americans to peacefully protest. He supports the First Amendment. But that is not the majority of the behavior that we have seen taking place in Los Angeles.
I'm sorry, that's just completely divorced from reality. It's more like the opposite of true. The overwhelming majority of protesters in Los Angeles have been peaceful. You, of course, would not know that from watching Fox News, which has been breathlessly covering the protests like a scene out of RoboCop, as if Los Angeles was at risk of burning to the ground any second. Banners proclaiming rioters wreak havoc in L.A. Violent anti-ICE protests spread nationwide. They're still at it, even now, days after the demonstrations died down, like looping the same things burning that were burning 4 days ago. And again, Donald Trump, who watches Fox all day, is pickling his brain in the brine of these lies. The White House even put out its own propaganda video, selectively editing a handful of moments from about 2 city blocks to make it look like the entire city of Los Angeles is burning to the ground. It's not. And yes, people have thrown bricks. They've lit cars on fire. You can see that. They shouldn't do that. They also don't speak for the vast majority of demonstrators who have been entirely peaceful and playing music and dancing and shouting slogans and engaging in prayer. And those people should keep demonstrating peacefully. This is why the right to, quote, peaceably assemble exists and is enshrined in the very First Amendment of the United States Constitution. We, the people, don't wield the power of the state. What the people have is the ability and the right to go out in the streets and to yell and to petition their government and, yes, peaceably assemble. You are allowed to publicly disagree with the government in this country. In fact, the American tradition of protest predates America itself. It's part of what gave rise to America. We all learned about the Boston Tea Party in school, which, by the way, was a lot more property damage than what we see in Los Angeles. Today, basically everybody understands that the protests for racial justice in the mid-20th century, what we call the civil rights movement, were one of the most effective mass mobilizations both in our country's history and in the world. Those protesters knew that while legal challenges to segregation were part of the solution, lawsuits and the like, tangible, nonviolent direct action was equally necessary for victory. Listen to this excerpt from the PBS documentary series American Experience.
Nothing changed in the South, which made it necessary for a new strategy to arise. And that new strategy was nonviolent direct action.
Nonviolent direct action is using nonviolence instead of violence. Nonviolent techniques invariably confront the segregated lunch counter, the segregated waiting room, against an integrated group of people who refuse to observe the signs or the law or the custom of the segregation.
Aspects of that same approach were replicated in mass opposition to the Vietnam War later in the 1960s, which was part of what ultimately forced President LBJ out of the 1968 presidential race. Take a listen to New York's Republican Mayor John Lindsay praising the discipline of the nonviolent protesters following the massive moratorium to end the war demonstration in 1969.
All New Yorkers, regardless of their views on the war in Vietnam, can take pride in their city's conduct yesterday. The dignity and decorum on all sides is a testament to the ability of a free people to debate without disruption or violence. The solemnity and purpose of the largest such gathering in history serve notice that the call for peace comes not from any fringe or extreme, but from the broad middle range of New Yorkers and Americans. I want to pay particular thanks to the youth of New York City. It is they who have felt the sharpest impact of the war and who have felt the deepest emotional division. The rallies, the candlelit marches, the silent vigils were peaceful, nonviolent, and dignified. They were a credit to any generation.
During each of these periods in history, there are almost without exception protesters among these groups that did stuff that I don't like, that a lot of people at the time didn't like, that went too far. There were endless debates about whether or not people were mobilizing the right kind of way. I mean, in 1961, for example, nearly 60% of Americans said that the lunch counter sit-ins and the Freedom Riders were hurting the integrationist cause. And a lot of times with these kinds of movements, it's only with hindsight we're able to see just how effective those protests really were. In this case, though, folks may already be waking up, and I think this might be the most important takeaway you have from tonight's program, although you should keep watching either way. Donald Trump is on the wrong side of history and underwater in the polls. A new Quinnipiac poll shows Donald Trump underwater by 11 points on immigration, down 16 points on deportations. Clear majorities oppose both outside the polls' margin of error. That's one poll. We'll see where everything shakes out. But in another victory for the right to protest today, a judge ruled that recent Columbia graduate student Mahmoud Khalil, who's currently being held in Louisiana, cannot be detained or deported over his protected free speech during campus protests against Israel's war on Gaza. It sometimes cannot feel like it. It sometimes feels like we're in a car in the snow where the tires are spinning. But but you get these moments where you can feel a little traction, and public opposition to Trump is working. Protest is how regular people, ordinary folks, make change in this country. Outside of elections and volunteering and working in politics, right? For most ordinary people in between election cycles, the people, the millions of them who are opposed to the assault of our most basic rights, it is the most powerful tool we have.